The trial of Charles I, I think, arguably is probably the most important event in British history. It's the first time when a legitimate head of state has been put on trial by a formal procedure for his life in the name of the people. So it was a moment when the sovereignty of the people overrode the divine authority of a king. One of the reasons why this is a significant moment is because it's the first time, certainly in British history, probably in European history, when there is a direct challenge between popular sovereignty and royal authority. So the idea that's born in it and is celebrated later on in 1688 and in the American Revolution of 1776 is that legitimate authority is created by the consent of the people, and there is a trust between community and ruler, and the ruler has to obey the office of trust, which is to benefit the common good. And Charles I is put on trial for compromising that, for breaking his trust, for acting in an ungodly and bloody way, actually persecuting and killing his people. So it's the first time that's instantiated in an event, and the claim of Parliament to judge the king in the name of the people was received with horror around the other monarchs of Europe. So it is the first moment of democratic resistance, if you like. The very event of the trial is in itself a significant constitutional moment, but the fact that the king was killed stunned not only the British state, but the entire literate European world. This was, and it's a slightly horrible analogy, but it's like the Twin Towers with the planes flying in and destroying the sort of cultural stability. Killing the king was killing God. God had appointed kings, and the Old Testament is full of examples, to rule over a sinful people. So killing the king, even though he was a tyrant, and they very cunningly in the trial reclassified him not as a king, because he'd broken his office. So he was like a tiger or a beast, a wild animal who could be dealt with in the appropriate way. And I think this was an act of incredible bravery. Very often the history books will tell you that this was predictable. Once Charles is put on trial, he's bound to be executed. But the only certainty was that Charles I was too arrogant to recognise that his life was in danger. And we know from research that the judges, the trial court, were making it up as they went along. It was contingent. They weren't sure what was happening. And if the king had pled, acknowledged the authority of the court, he might have got off. And as they said in the final judgment, we may not acquit the guilty. And they literally cited from the Old Testament King Nebuchadnezzar, who was a bad tyrant, but he apologised. So Charles I refused to apologise, so had to die. But arguably, we didn't know he was going to die until the last 20 minutes or so. And even then, there might have been ways out, but he resolutely refused to acknowledge the power of the court. So this, it's about regime change in one sense, but this is a climacteric, very old-fashioned word, but a moment that really stunned the whole of Europe. And we know this because the Dutch, the French, the Spanish were reporting almost within hours of his execution. And if we think this world was a providential one, everything's in its order, a natural order. Every little stone is put there by God. Human beings, fathers ruling over mothers and daughters and sons, gentlemen ruling over servants, kings ruling over communities. Well, they've just chopped that off. So the whole state of nature is disrupted. So this would have, there are lots of reports of people falling down in faints, women aborting their children, all sorts of catastrophes, because the state of nature has been turned upside down. So it was almost incomprehensible, which is probably why most people in the UK today barely know it happened, because it was such a threat to the established order.